The storm rolled in like a beast the moment the casket was lowered into the ground. Thick, angry clouds swirled above the cemetery, casting shadows over the gathered mourners. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then relentless, like the sky couldn't hold its grief either. Julia gripped the black umbrella tighter as wind whipped her hair across her face. She stood beside her younger brother Ethan, both of them soaked despite their best efforts. Neither spoke. What could they say? Elise Whitaker, Grandma Elise, had been the last anchor tying them to a childhood that now felt impossibly far away. The funeral was brief. Elise had requested no eulogies, no choir, no flowers, just the basics. "Return me to the earth and let it be done," she had written in her will. But that wasn't all she wrote. After the service, the lawyer handed Julia a manila envelope, old and creased. Inside was a handwritten letter on yellowed stationery, her grandmother's looping cursive unmistakable. "Do not open the trunk in the attic," it began. "Not ever. Promise me this, Julia. Promise me you'll keep it shut. What's inside doesn't belong to us anymore." Julia's hands trembled as she read it aloud. Ethan frowned beside her, skeptical as always. What trunk? What is she even talking about? But Julia knew. They both did. There had always been whispers about the attic, stories told in half-jokes at family dinners, a creaking above them that no one acknowledged. When they were children, Elise had forbidden them from going up there. "That room is locked for a reason," she'd say, her voice cutting through their protests like a blade. Now, with Elise gone, the silence around that room felt heavier than ever. Back at the house, the rain intensified. The old Victorian home stood as it always had, stoic, weathered and grand. Its white paint peeled slightly at the edges, and ivy clung to its stones like ancient fingers. As they stepped inside, the smell hit them. Not rot, not mildew, just age. Time, layered and dusty. Furniture covered in sheets. Clocks that had stopped ticking. A mirror in the hallway that seemed a shade darker than it should be. They were alone now. No more cousins, no more distant relatives. Just Julia and Ethan, and the house that felt like it had been waiting for them. "It's just a trunk," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "An old box, probably empty or filled with junk. She was losing it near the end." Julia shook her head. "No, she wasn't delusional. You saw the letter. She was serious." "Exactly," Ethan replied, "which is what makes it weird. Why spend your dying breath warning us about a box?" They stood in the foyer, wet coats dripping onto the wood floor. A chill passed between them that had nothing to do with the rain. From above, something creaked. They both froze. It was faint, but deliberate, a groan from the attic floorboards. Julia exhaled slowly. "We should leave it alone." "For how long?" Ethan asked. "Forever." "You want to sell the house with a mystery in the attic." She looked up the staircase, past the banister, toward the dark hallway that led to the attic door. She remembered the feeling she used to get as a child whenever she looked up there, like something was staring back. "It's not our secret to open," she whispered, but the secret was already pulling them toward it. Subscribe now if you're hooked by mysteries like this. There's more to come. What's inside that trunk might just change everything they thought they knew. The rain hadn't let up by the time Julia and Ethan stepped back inside the house. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing out the storm and enclosing them in a silence that felt almost sacred. The air was heavy, scented with aged wood, dried lavender, and something else, faint, metallic, unfamiliar. Julia walked through the front hall slowly, her fingers brushing against the wallpaper, the faded floral pattern peeling at the edges. Everything was just as Elise had left it. Every book, every photograph, every clock set to the same frozen hour, 3:12. Ethan dropped his duffel bag on the floor. "Still creepy," he muttered, glancing toward the curved staircase that led to the upper levels. "I always hated sleeping here." Julia didn't respond. Her eyes had settled on the painting above the fireplace. It was a portrait of Elise as a young woman, stern-faced, proud, and distant. Something in her expression had always made Julia uncomfortable, though she could never explain why. It wasn't just the coldness. It was the way the eyes seemed to follow you. She turned away and headed toward the kitchen. Dust had settled thickly across the countertops, undisturbed. The old kettle still sat on the stove, its handle wrapped in a crocheted cloth. A note was pinned to the refrigerator in Elise's handwriting, "Do not forget the cellar key." But the key was gone. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "So, how long are we staying?" "A few days, just enough to sort through the house. The attorney said we need to find the property deed, the insurance documents, and anything important." "You mean anything weird?" Julia shot him a look. "This isn't a joke." He held up his hands. "I'm just saying this house always felt like a haunted museum." They started upstairs, floorboards groaning beneath their weight. Dust motes danced in the slivers of grey light that cut through the stained glass windows. As they reached the landing, the temperature dropped sharply. "Did you feel that?" Julia asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, rubbing his arms. "Like a draft or something." They moved down the hallway toward the guest bedrooms, passing the closed attic door. Its brass knob was tarnished, a faint black smudge near its base like someone had once tried to burn it shut. Julia's eyes lingered on it. "We're not opening it," she said firmly. "I wasn't going to," Ethan replied, though the curiosity in his voice betrayed him. They settled into separate rooms for the night. Julia took the bedroom she used as a child, still decorated with lace curtains and pale blue wallpaper. Ethan chose the room across the hall, smaller and darker. Hours passed. The storm raged on. Somewhere deep in the house something shifted, a soft thud, then another. Julia sat up in bed, her ears straining. The sounds repeated, not loud but deliberate, like footsteps, from above. She tiptoed into the hallway and saw Ethan already there, his door open, hair disheveled. "You heard it too?" he asked. She nodded. They stared up at the attic door. Silence. Then, scratch. Ethan stepped closer. "Rats?" Julia shook her head slowly. That wasn't rats. The sound stopped. The house fell quiet again. Ethan backed away. "We should go back to sleep." Julia didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the attic door, its outline pulsing in the dim light like it was breathing. The air had shifted. The house wasn't just old, it was watching them. Morning brought little relief. The sky remained a heavy slate grey, clouds unmoving, as if time itself had slowed around the house. Julia woke early and found herself drawn to the attic door once again. She didn't touch it, just stood there staring, trying to quiet the unease twisting in her chest. Downstairs, Ethan was already up, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, his eyes locked on the window. "Sleep?" Julia asked, sitting across from him. He shook his head. "Something moved around up there." "I'm sure of it. We agreed not to open it. I didn't say I was going to, just saying." They ate in silence. The air inside the house was too still, too expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Later, while sorting through Elise's papers in the study, Julia found a photo album buried beneath old tax documents. She hadn't seen it since she was 13. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, and the pages inside smelled like dust and rosewater. She flipped through slowly. Photos of birthday parties in the backyard, Elise holding pies fresh from the oven, Julia and Ethan on the tire swing, all sunlit memories frozen in faded tones. And then, on the last page, an unfamiliar photo. It showed Elise in her 20s, standing beside a tall, narrow trunk. Her hair was pinned back and she wore a long, dark coat. But it was her face that made Julia stop. There was no smile, no warmth, just a blank expression. Her eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were staring past it. The trunk was unmistakable, carved with ornate patterns, a deep reddish hue, and bound in iron. Behind Elise stood a shadowed figure, blurry, almost smudged from the photograph. Julia's stomach tightened. She brought the photo to Ethan. "Have you seen this before?" He frowned. "No. That's the trunk?" "Yeah. And look, someone's behind her." Ethan studied it. "Could be a tree or something. Or a photo error." "It's not a tree." "You think Grandma was afraid of it?" "She was terrified of it." Ethan sighed and leaned back. "I always thought it was a game she played, you know, to keep us out of certain places, Like that room with all the antique dolls. Julia closed the album. It wasn't a game. She used to check the attic lock every night before bed. She never let the key out of her sight. They both fell silent. The ticking from the grandfather clock echoed through the halls, steady, unyielding. But when Julia glanced toward it, she realized the hands hadn't moved. It was still 3:12. Later that afternoon, Julia returned to the hallway upstairs and stood at the attic door again. Her hand hovered over the knob but didn't touch it. She remembered something Elise had said when she was 7. A storm had knocked out the power, and Julia had been frightened. Elise had sat beside her and whispered, "Don't be afraid of thunder, be afraid of the silence after." At the time, Julia hadn't understood, but now the silence in the house felt louder than any storm. She turned to go back to her room when she caught sight of something on the floor, small, almost hidden in the shadow. A marble. It rolled slowly across the wood, coming to a stop at her foot. Julia bent to pick it up. It was red with a swirl of black inside. She hadn't seen that marble in over 20 years. It had belonged to her. She'd lost it the summer she and Ethan dared each other to peek into the attic keyhole. She had dropped it, and it had rolled under the door. Elise had found them moments later, furious, shaking, and she had shouted louder than Julia had ever heard her. That marble had never been returned, until now. That night the wind howled harder than it had in days. The windows rattled in their frames, and tree branches scraped along the siding like nails across a coffin lid. Julia had gone to bed early, her nerves frayed from the marble, the photograph, and the weight of the past pressing on her like a second skin. Ethan didn't sleep. Something gnawed at him, curiosity, or maybe the need to feel in control of something, anything. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks above. The attic had always called to him even when they were children. He used to imagine treasure up there, secrets, puzzles waiting to be solved. Now that same urge burned again, stronger than ever. He got up around midnight, careful not to wake Julia. The house was darker than it should have been. The hallway light flickered once, then died completely. He climbed the stairs in silence, flashlight in hand, the beam flickering with every step. The attic door loomed ahead, larger than he remembered. He hesitated just a moment before gripping the knob. It turned without resistance. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the hallway like a sigh. Inside, the attic was colder than the rest of the house. The air was dry, heavy with dust and the faint smell of old cedar. Ethan stepped carefully across the floor, floorboards groaning beneath his weight. Shadows clung to the corners like spiderwebs. And then he saw it. The trunk sat at the far end of the attic, half shrouded in a dusty sheet. It wasn't as large as he imagined, but it radiated something. Presence, weight, silence. The wood was dark and worn smooth with time, carved with strange patterns, spirals, loops, and what looked like eyes. 3 iron locks sealed it shut, thick and rusted. Wax had been dripped across the seams and hardened over the years like old blood. Ethan knelt beside it. He didn't touch it at first. Just studied it, flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. "Grandma, what the hell were you hiding?" he whispered. Something moved behind him. He spun, but there was nothing, just the empty attic and the slow settling of dust. He could hear his own breathing now, sharp and quick. Still, he couldn't walk away. He reached out and ran a finger along the carvings. The wood was strangely warm. The symbols seemed to shift beneath his touch, not visually, but in feeling, like something pulsed behind the grain. He put his hand on the lid. A whisper. He froze. It was faint, barely audible. A single word that sounded like it came from inside the trunk. "Please." Ethan jerked his hand back. The word echoed in his head, not loud but unshakable. He looked around again, heart pounding. No one. Nothing. He knelt closer. "Hello?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Silence. Then the light from his flashlight flickered again. This time it didn't come back. Darkness enveloped the attic. He stood up quickly, breathing hard, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The whisper didn't return, but the feeling in the air had changed, thicker, charged, watching. He stumbled back toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he reached for the knob, he heard another sound behind him, softer than before but unmistakable. A creaking hinge. The trunk hadn't opened, but something inside had moved. He didn't look back. Ethan didn't tell Julia what happened that night. He wanted to, almost did, but something inside him warned against it. She wouldn't understand. She'd say it was stress, exhaustion, imagination, and maybe it was. But he didn't believe that. Instead, he spent the next day combing through the house alone, searching. For what? He wasn't entirely sure. Clues, maybe, or signs that Elise had left something more behind. He found himself drawn to the study, to the bookshelves filled with dusty hardcovers and cracked leather spines. A particular volume stood out, a worn, oversized Bible bound in dark green leather. It wasn't hidden, just out of place among Elise's usual paperbacks and gardening guides. When he opened it, something dropped from between the pages and landed on the floor with a soft metallic clink. It was a key, small, blackened with age, shaped like a miniature dagger. The teeth were uneven, almost handmade. Ethan stared at it for a long time, then flipped through the pages where it had been tucked. Psalm 121. A verse was underlined twice in red ink. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. He shall preserve thy soul. He closed the Bible slowly, fingers tightening around the key. That night, he returned to the attic. He told Julia he couldn't sleep, but she was already half asleep, murmuring something unintelligible into her pillow. He slipped past her door without another word. The attic welcomed him, like it had been waiting. This time the flashlight worked without flicker. The trunk sat motionless, but Ethan noticed something different. He wasn't as afraid. He was curious, calm, almost drawn in. He knelt again and held up the key. To his surprise, it slid smoothly into the leftmost lock. Click. The sound was soft but final. The iron gave way without resistance, as though it had been expecting the key all along. Immediately the air shifted. The light dimmed, not from the flashlight, but from the atmosphere itself. The dust in the attic seemed to still. So even the wind outside paused. Ethan exhaled and leaned back. The unlocked latch hung open, the first of three. Nothing happened, and yet something had. That night, his dreams returned, vivid and unfamiliar. He found himself standing in the hallway outside the attic, except the house was subtly wrong. The walls pulsed. The lights blinked in time with his heartbeat. A voice whispered his name over and over, sometimes Elise's, sometimes not. Then he saw her, Grandma Elise, standing at the top of the stairs, pale, expressionless, her dress soaked as though she had come from the rain. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed directly at him. Behind her, a figure moved. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The sheets tangled around his legs. It was barely dawn. The sky outside was still grey. Julia was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad and a stack of opened letters. "Bad dream?" she asked. He nodded but didn't elaborate. She pushed a mug of coffee toward him. "I've been going through her mail. There's a lot of it." "Some of it's decades old." Ethan took a sip and tried to clear his head. "Anything strange?" "Stranger than everything else?" He gave a half laugh. "Fair." Julia flipped one envelope toward him. It had no stamp, just a name scrawled on the front. "Mirabelle." Ethan froze. "What is it?" Julia asked. He didn't answer. He just stared at the name. It meant nothing to him, and yet he had heard it. In the dream, Julia had never seen the name before. Mirabelle was written in uneven cursive, like it had been scribbled in haste or with a shaking hand. The envelope itself was old, yellowed, brittle at the edges, sealed not with glue, but with wax that had long since cracked. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she dug deeper into the pile, drawn by instinct more than purpose. Dozens of letters, some bound in ribbon, others scattered loose, were crammed into a wooden cigar box she found beneath the floorboard of Elise's wardrobe. None had ever been mailed. All were addressed to the same person, Samuel Whitaker, her grandfather. Long dead, died in 1961 before Julia was born. She hadn't thought of him in years. She opened the first letter and read it slowly. Dearest Samuel, I can still hear her voice in the hallway. I've tried to block it out, but the walls remember. The attic remembers. I should have said no, but I didn't. I agreed. I signed. And now it watches me. Julia frowned. The handwriting was unmistakably Elise's, but the tone was alien, panicked, fragmented. She turned the page and kept reading. They told me it would protect us. That the gift came with a cost, but not a permanent one. They said it would sleep if I was careful, but it doesn't sleep. It listens. It waits. There was more, rambling, cryptic references to the pact and the blood seal, mentions of a third voice in the room, someone she only called M. With each letter, Elise unraveled further. Her words became less coherent, drifting between sorrow and terror. Mirabelle is not her name, it's what she calls herself now, but it's not who she was. Not really. You saw what happened to the mirror. You heard the nursery door open. I know you did. I should have burned it, but I couldn't. I wasn't brave enough. Julia looked up from the pile, her mouth dry. She picked up the sealed envelope again, the one marked Mirabelle. Against her better judgment, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. This one was shorter. You said you would stay asleep. You said you would not come back. This is not what we agreed. There was no signature. Just a red smear at the bottom, like a fingerprint, but smeared and wet-looking, though it left no stain on her fingers. Julia put the letter down and stared at the window. Outside, the sky had darkened further, though the clock on the wall insisted it was barely past noon. She found Ethan in the library, pacing. I found letters, she said quietly. He stopped. What kind of letters? She handed him the one addressed to Mirabelle. He read it twice, then looked at her. You've heard that name before, haven't you? She asked. Ethan nodded slowly. In my dream, Elise whispered it, right before she pointed at me. Julia pulled out the longer letter, the one about the pact. I think Grandma made some kind of deal, with someone, or something. Something that lives in the attic. Or in the trunk, Ethan added, his voice barely above a whisper. They sat in silence for a while. The weight of the truth, or the shape of it, had begun to form. Not clearly, not yet, but enough to unsettle every certainty they had brought with them. Eventually Julia spoke again. Why wouldn't she just destroy it? Ethan's eyes drifted toward the ceiling. Because maybe she couldn't. Neither of them noticed the mirror on the far wall, how the surface had rippled ever so slightly, as if disturbed by breath. It was Ethan who first suggested the cellar, not out of logic, but instinct. The letters had stirred something. Memories, fragments of Elise's old habits. She used to keep things there, but only things she didn't want found. The kind of things you don't donate or burn. The kind you bury. The cellar door groaned open with effort. The hinges fought them as if the house itself resisted. Dust clouded the air, and a thick chill clung to the narrow stairs. They descended slowly. The single bulb overhead flickered but held, casting long shadows against the stone walls. The cellar had changed. As children, it had felt cramped and harmless, full of canned peaches and old toolboxes. Now it seemed vast, deeper than it had any right to be. Shelves lined the walls, covered in sheets. A large wardrobe stood in the far corner, sealed with a leather belt looped tight around the handles. Ethan stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath him. I'll check that, he said, pointing to the wardrobe. Julia moved toward a crate of old books, the paper brittle and eaten at the corners. She pulled one out, fanned the pages, and froze. There, tucked into the binding, was a small piece of cloth. Inside it, a key, rusted and dull with a strange shape, not quite square, not quite round, like it didn't belong to any normal lock. Ethan noticed her holding it. That's not one of the house keys. It's the second one, she said, her voice certain. He came over and stared at it. How can you be sure? I don't know, but it feels the same, like the one from the Bible. Ethan took it gently and turned it in his palm. A low sound rumbled through the cellar, soft and vibrating, like a sigh trapped in stone. They froze. Then something moved, a whisper against the floorboards, a scrape. Ethan turned toward the wardrobe just as the belt began to tighten on its own, the leather pulling taut like it was resisting being opened. He stepped back. "Nope," he muttered. "Not opening that." Julia clutched his arm, her voice low. "We need to leave." Now. They climbed the stairs faster than they had descended, heartbeats hammering. At the top, Julia slammed the door shut behind them and locked it. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. They just stood in the hallway, breathing. Then Ethan held up the key again. "We're one away." Julia shook her head slowly. "This isn't a game. We shouldn't keep going. You read the letters. Whatever she sealed in that thing, it's not sleeping anymore." "Exactly," Julia snapped, "which is why we should leave it locked." Ethan looked at her. His face was pale, but his eyes held a quiet resolve. "We can't pretend it's not happening," he said. "It's already waking up. We're in it, whether we want to be or not." She didn't respond. Later that night, as they sat in the living room wrapped in blankets, Julia went back through Elise's notes. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. In the margins of one, near the bottom, a line caught her eye. "The second is buried. The third must be taken from time." She didn't understand it. Not yet. But a piece had shifted. A clue, maybe. A path. Upstairs, the mirror in the hallway cracked. Just once, a jagged line slicing through the center like a scar. Neither of them heard it. Julia couldn't sleep. Not after the cellar. Not after the key. She sat alone in the upstairs study, surrounded by open boxes and scattered pages, trying to make sense of what Elise had left behind. It wasn't just clutter. It was intentional. Pieces of something bigger, messages hidden in plain sight. A creak in the floor pulled her attention toward the bookshelf. One shelf sagged lower than the others, and the books there didn't match. Gardening manuals beside legal volumes and cookbooks. Something about the arrangement felt forced. She reached out and tapped each spine until one gave way slightly. Behind the row of books, her hand found a gap. Tucked inside it was a thin black notebook, worn at the corners, wrapped with a string of red thread. She sat down and carefully undid the knot. The first page was blank. The second bore her grandmother's name, Elise R. Whitaker, written in a hurried scrawl that barely resembled her usual careful penmanship. "If you found this, then it means the pact is close to breaking," Julia read on, her breath catching with every line. "The year was 1948. Mirabelle came to me in a dream first. She was beautiful, persuasive, desperate. I was young, foolish, grieving. She said she could bring Samuel back. I believed her. I signed my name in the book before I understood what it meant. There is no resurrection. Only rearrangement. What came back wore his face. It used his voice, but it wasn't Samuel." Julia turned the page, heart pounding. "She feeds on memory. She grows stronger in silence. That's why the house is quiet now. That's why the clocks don't move." She looked toward the hallway. The broken mirror, the stopped clocks, all of it suddenly made sense. There are rules. The trunk must stay sealed. The room must stay locked. The 3 keys must never be held at once. I have hidden the final piece where time cannot decay it. The next entry shifted in tone. The writing grew erratic, slanted across the page. I saw her in the mirror. She smiled at me, but my reflection did not. She whispered my name backwards. She told me Julia would open it. Julia stopped. Her throat tightened. She read the line again. She told me Julia would open it. She slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. It couldn't be true. Elise had always protected her. Why would she write that? Unless Elise had seen something. Unless the dreams weren't just madness. She stood, needing air, clarity, anything. As she moved, a piece of paper slipped from the back cover and fluttered to the floor. It wasn't a page, it was a torn photograph. Elise again, older this time. Her eyes red-rimmed, face drawn. She stood next to a mirror, but in the reflection, there was no Elise, just a shadowed figure behind the glass with bright white eyes. Ethan appeared at the door. I heard a noise. You okay? Julia turned slowly, the journal clutched to her chest. I found her journal. What's in it? She made a deal, Julia said. Not just any deal. A binding. Ethan frowned. With Mirabelle? She called it a pact, said she signed her name in a book, said the thing that came back wasn't Grandpa. He stepped closer. Do you think she's still here? Julia didn't answer right away. I think part of her is, she whispered. But more than that. I think something else is too, and it's been waiting. They stood in silence, the journal between them like a living thing. Neither of them noticed the faint, smudged handprint now blooming slowly on the wall behind them. Julia didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the pages of the journal came back. Elise's shaky handwriting, the reflection with no face, and the words, "She told me Julia would open it." She watched the clock across the room. It still read 3:12. It always read 3:12. Down the hall, Ethan moved restlessly in his room. At some point, he rose and opened the door. Julia heard his footsteps pass by, soft against the wood. She followed without speaking. He was standing in front of the grandfather clock. It had belonged to their great-grandfather, a towering thing of oak and brass that hadn't worked since Elise's death. Ethan was staring at it, eyes fixed on the pendulum. "It's not just broken," he said. "I think something's wrong with it." He knelt and opened the lower hatch. Inside, beside the weighted gears and dust, sat a small black object tucked into the base, a key, the third. Ethan reached for it slowly, as if expecting it to bite. It was cold to the touch, sharper in shape than the others. This one looked ancient, like it predated the house itself. He stood and turned to Julia. She said nothing. They didn't need to discuss what came next. The attic door was waiting. They climbed the stairs in silence. The hallway felt tighter now, like the house was leaning inward, breathing in time with their steps. The light from their phones flickered at odd intervals, casting long, shivering shadows on the walls. The attic door groaned open. The air was dry, dense. The trunk sat in its place like a sentinel, unchanged, unmoved, and yet impossibly present. Ethan stepped forward and inserted the second key into the middle lock. A satisfying click echoed across the floorboards. He turned and held out the third. Julia took it, her hand shaking. The key felt heavier than it should have. She moved to the final lock on the right. "Wait," Ethan said. "Are you sure?" "No," she whispered. "But we're past sure now." She slid the key in. It turned. The final lock snapped open with a jolt of energy that made the floor vibrate beneath their feet. A sudden pressure filled the air, like the attic had inhaled and was holding its breath. The trunk began to shake, not violently, just enough to make the dust lift in clouds around it. Her thin black vapor seeped from the seams. Not smoke, something heavier like silk soaked in oil. It coiled upward and dissipated. Julia backed away. "Don't open it," she said quickly. "I didn't touch it," Ethan replied. They watched as the trunk stopped moving. But the attic didn't return to silence. From the shadows behind them, a whisper came, soft, feminine, almost sweet. "One of you has already invited me." Ethan turned but saw no one. "Did you hear that?" he asked, voice tight. Julia nodded. Neither of them dared move closer. The trunk sat still, the locks open, but the lid closed. Waiting. Julia felt a sharp pain in her chest, like a thread being pulled tight. Her vision blurred for a second. She grabbed Ethan's arm to steady herself. Then the attic light above them flickered, once, twice, and blew out. Total darkness. Ethan reached for his phone, but it slipped from his fingers. A loud crack followed as it hit the floor. The screen went dark. Julia's voice was barely audible. "We need to leave now." Ethan nodded, breath quickening. They backed out of the attic step by careful step, never turning their backs to the trunk. As soon as the door shut, the house exhaled. But the air hadn't cleared, and somewhere behind that sealed door, something had stirred. The house felt colder after the third lock gave way, not in temperature, but in presence, like something unseen now shared the air with them. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was loaded, oppressive. Every room seemed to echo with a breath that didn't belong to them. Julia didn't sleep. Ethan didn't try. By morning, neither of them had spoken more than a few words. They didn't need to. The understanding between them had deepened into something unspoken. They had crossed a boundary, and nothing could be undone. At noon, as if compelled by the same silent force, they returned to the attic. The light was dimmer now, though no bulbs had burned out. The shadows had thickened, stretching into corners that once held nothing. The trunk waited. It sat open. Neither of them had touched it. The lid had lifted just slightly, an inch at most, but enough to reveal darkness inside, deeper than it should have been. A darkness that didn't reflect light. It seemed to pull it inward. Ethan stepped forward, drawn by some invisible pull. Julia followed, heart hammering. Inside the trunk there were no bones, no diaries, no family heirlooms. Instead they found 3 objects. A doll, human-shaped, crudely stitched, made entirely from strands of hair. Some dark brown, some grey, some red. The face had no features, just thread marks where eyes and mouth should have been. An hourglass, its glass fogged from the inside, filled not with sand but with ash. The ash didn't fall. It hovered mid-air, suspended in time. And finally, a photograph. Ethan picked it up. It was a picture of a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in a field of high grass. Her face was turned slightly, blurred, but behind her stood Elise, unmistakably younger, a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Who is she?" Ethan asked. Julia took the photo and stared. "I think it's her sister." Elise didn't have a sister. "She did," Julia whispered. "She died when they were kids, or that's what they told us." Ethan looked down into the trunk. "This isn't death." As Julia reached for the hourglass, her fingertips brushed the rim, and the attic shifted. Not visibly, but in sensation. The air thickened, the walls seemed to pulse, and time stopped. The tick of the house, the drip from the bathroom faucet, the far-off creak of settling wood, all vanished. Everything was still. Julia's body locked in place. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Only her mind surged, screaming. And then she saw her. At the far end of the attic, where the light didn't reach, a figure began to emerge. Slowly, like fog gathering form. A girl in a dress, pale as paper, her hair long and dripping. Her face, and wasn't right. No features, just darkness. But from within that blank void, something shimmered. A whisper echoed, not out loud, but directly inside their skulls. "Thank you." Julia dropped the hourglass. It didn't shatter. It simply vanished the moment it touched the floor. Time resumed. Ethan gasped beside her, stumbling back. Julia grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the attic door. "We need to get out." But the staircase had changed. Where it once descended to the second floor, there was now only blackness. Not shadow, not lack of light, void. Julia turned back. The trunk was now fully open, its lid propped like a yawning mouth. The doll had moved, closer to the edge. Its head tilted, thread face staring directly at them. Ethan stepped forward before she could stop him. "There's something else inside," he said, voice flat. Julia pulled him back. "No." He looked at her. His eyes were wrong, the pupils too wide, the color slightly drained. He smiled. But it wasn't Ethan's smile. Julia stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, but something behind them had changed, something watching not from his face but through it. His expression held a calm that didn't belong to him. Detached. Ancient. "Ethan," she whispered. He tilted his head, studying her. "She remembers you," he said quietly. The voice was his, but not. Julia took another step back. The attic groaned. Outside, the wind surged, but no trees moved. The windows remained still. Everything outside the house had faded, as if the world had peeled away. "I don't understand," she said. "You do," he replied. "You've always felt it. The pull, the memory." Behind him, the hourglass reappeared inside the trunk, whole again. The ash swirled violently now, like it boiled from some invisible storm. The doll was gone. Julia's heart raced. "What do you want?" Ethan, or the thing inside him, smiled faintly. It's not about want. It's about return, about reclamation. She kept us caged too long. She? Julia asked. Elise. She broke the circle. She made promises and buried the debt. Julia's thoughts darted through everything she'd read. The journal, the pact, the photo. Elise hadn't sealed away evil for power or revenge. She had made a bargain she couldn't break, and now someone or something had come to collect. The mirror in the hallway cracked again. Julia flinched. The sound came from every direction, echoing like gunfire in an empty cathedral. She ran out of the attic, down the stairs, but the house had changed. Every mirror she passed was fractured, and in each one her reflection turned toward her, delayed, just a second too slow. Each mirrored version held her gaze longer than it should have, smiling with a mouth just a little too wide. She reached the ground floor, lights flickered. A whisper chased her through the hallways, her name breathed again and again. Julia. 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 She stumbled into the parlor and collapsed into a chair, heart pounding. She tried to catch her breath, but the air was thick, syrupy, resisting every inhale. Ethan descended slowly behind her, each step deliberate. She turned and saw his reflection in the parlor mirror. It wasn't Ethan. The figure in the glass wore his body, but not his posture. Its head jerked slightly to the side, as if testing the shape of the bones it now controlled. And when it smiled, its teeth were no longer human. "I'm not letting you take him," Julia said, standing. The lights above her burst, showering the room with sparks. The whisper became a roar. Every picture frame in the room fell at once, glass shattering against the floor. Ethan blinked. For a moment, his real eyes flickered back. "Julia, help me." Then he screamed, a sound not meant for human lungs. It echoed through the house like a siren, a sound so unnatural that the walls seemed to shudder. Julia covered her ears, but it vibrated through her bones. The floor beneath her rippled like water, and from every corner of the house shadows slithered into the light. They weren't people, not spirits, not creatures. They were forms, lurching, featureless, dripping shapes that defied logic. Their edges curled into smoke, their limbs bent the wrong way, and still they crawled closer. Julia ran. Through the kitchen, through the dining room. Toward the back door. It didn't open. No matter how hard she pulled, it didn't move. The house had sealed itself. She turned and saw Ethan standing in the hallway, now completely still, his head bowed, his hands limp at his sides. He looked up slowly, and behind his eyes, something smiled. Julia locked herself in the upstairs bathroom, hands trembling as she shoved the old vanity against the door. She wasn't sure it would stop anything, but it gave her a moment to breathe, a moment to think. Her reflection in the cracked mirror looked unfamiliar, paler, older. The edges of her face seemed to ripple slightly, like water disturbed by touch. She blinked, and for a second her reflection didn't. A knock sounded at the door. Not loud, just deliberate. "Julia," Ethan said from the other side. "You don't need to be afraid." His voice was wrong again, too smooth, too controlled. She didn't answer. She turned toward the cabinet under the sink and tore it open. Inside were toiletries, rags, a metal box marked "Private." She opened it. Inside, beneath old photographs and a rusted locket, was a folder. Thick, yellowed, labeled simply Mirabelle Whittaker. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first page was a birth certificate. Mirabelle Elise Whittaker, born minutes after Elise Ruth Whittaker, identical twins. Julia's breath caught. She flipped to the next page. A medical record. Age 7. Diagnosis: persistent hallucinations, violent behavior, dissociation. Recommended institutionalization. Next, a police report. Incident dated 1948. Family claims accident. Child injured in attic. Fire damage minimal. One child presumed dead. No body recovered. Julia's heart pounded. No body recovered. The final document was a handwritten letter from Elise herself, dated decades later. "I lied, to everyone, even to Samuel. She never died. I couldn't bring myself to kill her. But I couldn't leave her in the world either. The pact was the only way. I sealed her in the trunk. Her body, her name, her power. Julia stared at the paper, her mind spinning. Mirabelle had been real. She hadn't died, she had been contained. And Elise had done it to her own sister. A loud thud shook the door behind her. Ethan's voice came again, more forceful. "Julia, you need to come out now." She backed away slowly, clutching the folder. "What are you?" she whispered. "Still Ethan," he said. "Mostly." She dropped the folder and ran. The hallway was darker now, the air heavy. Pictures on the wall had warped, their frames bent, the faces inside distorted. Some were missing entirely, as if erased from memory. The attic door stood open. She climbed. The trunk waited, empty now. The doll gone. The hourglass cracked, its ash spiraling into nothing. The photograph lay torn in half on the floor. In the corner of the attic, the mirror from the hallway had appeared. Its glass was solid black. Julia stepped closer. Her reflection appeared, but it wasn't her. It was Elise, older, hollow-eyed. Her mouth moved, though no sound emerged. Then a whisper, faint and desperate. "Finish it." Julia blinked. "How?" The reflection pointed behind her. She turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes distant, his smile too wide. "She's awake now," he said softly. "There's no going back." Julia looked down. The doll was at her feet again. Its head turned slowly toward her, and from within its stitched mouth, a single whisper escaped. "Sister." Julia stood frozen as the doll's whisper echoed in her ears. Sister. Not a name, not a plea, just a truth. A bond that death, time, and even Elise's desperate magic hadn't erased. Ethan took another step into the attic. His eyes flickered again, a glimmer of Ethan buried beneath something darker, something watching. "Come with me," he said, voice soft. "It's easier if you stop fighting." Julia stepped back, scanning the floor. The journal. It had to be here. Her foot brushed against something. She looked down. Elise's journal lay sprawled open, its pages fluttering like wings. She dropped to her knees, flipping quickly through it, past the pacts, past the warnings, until she saw a page she hadn't noticed before. The ink was smeared, the handwriting more frantic than the rest. But 3 words were circled in red. "The seal breaks." Below it a line scrawled like a desperate command. What was bound in blood must be undone in blood. She remembered the cut on Elise's finger in an old photo. The way her grandmother always wore gloves in the house, the missing scissors from the sewing kit. This wasn't superstition, it was ritual. Mirabelle moved closer. "She's gone, Julia. Elise couldn't stop it, you won't either." But Julia wasn't listening. She grabbed the broken locket from the floor, the one that had been in the folder marked Mirabelle. Inside was a faded lock of hair and a photograph so degraded it was barely visible. She pulled a pin from her sleeve and pricked her finger. Blood welled up, bright and urgent. She smeared it on the page over the circle. The attic shook. A long, low groan filled the house like the bones of the structure crying out. Ethan clutched his head. "What are you doing?" Julia didn't stop. Undoing what she did, or finishing what she started. She turned the hourglass over, even though its glass was cracked. The ash swirled downward violently now, rushing toward the bottom like a vortex. Wind whipped through the attic, though the windows were shut. The doll screamed, not loud, but high-pitched and shrill, as if the thread itself had come alive, its head twisted and its limbs convulsed, unraveling slowly. Ethan staggered forward. "You don't know what you're unleashing." "I'm not unleashing," she said. "I'm releasing." The black mirror behind her cracked straight down the center. From it, Elise's face appeared briefly, eyes filled with something that looked like sorrow. Her mouth moved again. "Finish it." Julia pulled the last piece from the trunk, a sliver of glass shaped like a dagger. She hadn't noticed it before, it pulsed in her hand. Ethan rushed at her. Too late. She cut her palm and let the blood fall into the hourglass. The ash turned red, then white, then vanished entirely. The trunk slammed shut on its own, the iron locks clamping into place. Ethan fell to the ground, gasping. His body convulsed once, then stilled. The attic went silent. No wind, no whispers, just quiet. Real quiet. Julia dropped the shard and fell to her knees beside Ethan. His eyes fluttered open, and they were his. Tears spilled down her face. "Are you?" He nodded weakly. "I think so." They sat there, breathless, surrounded by the debris of a lifetime of secrets. Julia reached for the journal and closed it slowly. Elise had tried to save them. In her way, she had succeeded. But the cost was everything. The silence after the ritual wasn't peace. It was anticipation. Ethan sat slumped against the attic wall, his chest rising slowly as if each breath was being negotiated. Julia kept her hand pressed to his, grounding him. The weight of what they'd just done hadn't sunk in yet. Her palm throbbed from the cut, her blood still drying across the hourglass, now completely empty. But the air wasn't still. Something lingered. "I felt her leave," Ethan said softly, eyes distant, but not all of her. Julia looked toward the mirror. The crack had spread, branching outward like veins. A black mist pulsed within the glass, ebbing and flowing like a tide. Elise's image was gone. In its place was something else. No face, no body. Just a presence coiled and watching. "We didn't finish it," Julia murmured. Ethan's voice trembled. "She's waiting, watching through what's left." A low creak echoed from the floor beneath them. Then another. The house shifted, as if it too had begun to breathe. Julia rose to her feet. "We have to end it. All of it." Ethan looked up. "How?" She turned toward the trunk. "The seal's closed, but she's still here. Elise kept her bound to this place. That's why the house is decaying. It's her prison, but also her anchor. You're saying we have to destroy the house?" "No," Julia said. "I have to destroy the house." Ethan's face darkened. "No, we do this together." She shook her head. "If you stay, she'll try again, through you, through me, through anyone tied to this bloodline." She reached into the journal again, flipping past the final pages. One entry stood out, written in jagged, slanted script. "If it returns, the binding must be broken from within. One blood, one sacrifice. Burn the root, not the leaves." Julia touched the trunk. It pulsed faintly beneath her fingers. Not alive, but not dead either. Something dormant, something waiting for its next host. "You said she fed on memory," Ethan said. Julia nodded. "Then we erase it. Not by forgetting, but by making sure there's nothing left to remember." She pulled him into a tight embrace. "Go." He didn't move. "Please." Ethan's voice cracked. "I'm not leaving you." "You already left me once," she whispered. "Don't do it again." His tears soaked her shoulder. "I'll come back for you." She smiled, even as her heart broke. "No. You won't." She handed him the journal, now folded and bound in a cloth from Elise's trunk. "Take this, show someone, not to explain but to warn." He hesitated one last time, then he turned and disappeared down the stairs. Julia stood alone in the attic, the air heavy with everything she was about to give up. She gathered the hourglass, the doll, the shards of the cracked mirror, and placed them in the trunk. It responded to her movements, not with sound but with gravity, like it knew the end had come. The trunk closed with a quiet sigh. She poured the oil she'd found in the cellar, lantern oil, old and potent, over the wood, over the beams, over the walls. She stood back, struck the match, and waited. The fire caught slowly at first, as though the house itself resisted. Then, as if surrendering, it erupted. Flames leapt from the floorboards, swallowed the walls, and licked up into the night. Down the hill, Ethan watched from the tree line, tears blurring his vision. The house did not scream, it did not collapse in horror, it simply vanished, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ash and wind. Ash fell for days where the house had stood, grey and fine as memory. Ethan returned only once, a week after the fire. There was nothing left, no foundation, no debris, not even the outline of the garden where Elise's roses had once bloomed, only bare earth, scorched and silent. He stood alone, clutching the wrapped journal Julia had given him. He'd read every page again and again, trying to piece together what had truly happened, searching for some meaning in the madness. He could still feel Julia's arms around him, hear her voice in the back of his mind, steady and sure, even as everything else had fallen apart. He wondered sometimes if any of it had been real. The trunk, the keys, the shadows moving behind mirrors. It felt impossible, distant, like the memory of a nightmare that lingers long after waking. But the scars on his hand, the ache in his bones, and the hollow in his chest where Julia used to be, those things remained. He never rebuilt. He never returned to the life he'd lived before. Instead, Ethan moved to a quiet town up north, living in a small apartment filled with light. He kept the journal locked away, out of sight, but some nights when the wind howled against the windows and the clock stopped ticking, he would feel the presence again, soft, insistent, a reminder that some debts can never truly be paid. One morning, a package arrived at his door. No return address, just his name, written in looping, familiar script. He opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in linen, was the hourglass from the trunk, now whole, its glass perfectly clear, filled with white sand. Beneath it, a single slip of paper. Thank you. Keep it sealed. Always. Elise. Ethan held the hourglass in his hands, heart pounding. He didn't know how it had survived or how it had found him, but he understood the message. Some things are meant to be left alone. Some secrets must remain secrets, even when the temptation to unravel them feels overwhelming. He placed the hourglass on the highest shelf and never touched it again. Years passed. The pain faded, but the memories lingered. Sometimes, in dreams, Ethan saw Julia standing among the ashes, smiling. Sometimes he heard Elise's laughter, echoing through empty rooms, but the shadows stayed gone. The mirrors in his home never cracked, and the clocks always ticked steady and true. Ethan lived quietly, gratefully, always watching for signs that the past might return. He told no one what had happened, except in the pages of a letter he wrote and sealed, never sent to Julia, tucked away beside the journal in a drawer. On quiet nights he whispered her name. On the darkest ones he thanked her. And he never ever opened the hourglass. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that linger long after they end. And if you want to know what else families keep hidden, click on the next video now, because some secrets are only just beginning to surface.